The countdown clock on the wall read 3 hours and 59 minutes, and I already knew I was going to fail. That was the first thought in my head when I looked down at my station and saw a bone lying where everyone else had a bar of gleaming durasteel. Not a metal, not an alloy. A bone, yellowed and rough, the kind of thing you would expect to find buried in dirt, not sitting on a polished workbench in a galactic classroom. My name is Mara Doyle, and I was the only human in a room of 31 alien cadets, all of us enrolled in a first-year course called Comparative Materials Science. I had picked it because it fit my schedule. I did not know it would turn into the most nerve-wracking afternoon of my life. The instructor floated above the room on his grav plate, 4 eyes scanning us like searchlights. His name was Instructor Vel, a Vashk, tall and thin, with a voice that clicked and hissed in a way that always made my skin prickle. Today's practical exam, he said, his mandibles snapping together for emphasis, requires each of you to forge a blade suitable for ceremonial presentation. You have 4 hours. Materials have been provided according to your species profile. Begin. 31 forges hissed to life at once. Sparks jumped. Metal began to glow. Everyone else knew exactly what to do, because everyone else had trained for this their whole lives. Blacksmithing was practically sacred on some of these worlds. It was in their blood the way breathing was in mine. I raised my hand. Instructor Vel drifted toward me, his grav plate humming low against the floor. He looked down at my station, at the pale, awkward length of bone lying there like a joke, and something in his 4 eyes flickered with what I can only describe as pity. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think there has been a mistake. I don't have the material everyone else has." "There is no mistake, Cadet Doyle," he said. "Human physiology was flagged as an edge case for today's lesson. Our supplier does not stock alloys compatible with your species' historical tool-making baseline. The system defaulted to a biological substitute from storage. I apologize for the inconvenience. You are welcome to simply observe the exercise today, if that would be easier." A few heads turned, not with cruelty, just curiosity, the way you might glance at a broken vending machine and wonder what went wrong inside it. My roommate was a Protesic named Sela, calm and quiet, with 6 fingers on each hand and a habit of finishing every assignment early. She leaned toward me, her voice low. "You can trade seats with me if you want," she said. "I usually finish fast anyway. I don't mind starting over." It would have been easy to say yes, easy to sit back, watch everyone else glow their metal into shape, and let this class become a story about the day the human student didn't get equal materials, and nobody blamed her for failing. But something in me refused to let it go that easily. "No," I said, "I'll figure it out." I don't know if it was pride or stubbornness, or something deeper, something that had been passed down to me without my ever noticing it arrive. But I picked up the bone, and I turned it over in my hands, and I decided I was not going to sit still for 4 hours doing nothing. The bone was heavier than it looked, dense in a way that made my wrist ache just holding it. It was smooth in places, like something had handled it for years before it ended up forgotten in a storage crate. There was a faint label stamped on the side of the tray it came in, species unknown, leftover material from an old xenobiology unit. I set it down and looked around the room. Forges roared. Metal shimmered gold and orange under heat. Everyone else was already shaping their blades, tapping them with small hammers, folding the metal over itself to strengthen it. I had no forge that could touch this, no hammer that would do anything but chip the surface. No idea at first what I was even supposed to do. Then I remembered my grandfather. When I was 11 years old, I spent a whole summer at his cabin because my parents were working long hours and needed someone to watch me. My grandfather did not believe in television or tablets at that cabin. He believed in chores, fresh air, and doing things the hard way, because the hard way taught you something the easy way never could. One afternoon, bored out of my mind, I found him sitting on the porch with a piece of deer antler in one hand and a flat rock in the other. He was grinding the antler slowly against the rock, over and over, in long, even strokes. "What are you doing?" I asked him. "Making a knife," he said, without looking up. "That's not a knife, that's a bone." He smiled, the kind of smile that meant he knew something I did not yet understand. Everything starts as something else, Mara. A knife is not born a knife, it becomes one. He handed me a rough stone and told me to try it myself. I remember complaining that my hands hurt after 10 minutes. He told me that was exactly the point. Anything worth making should cost you something. By the end of that summer, I had made a small, ugly, but functional blade out of a scrap of bone, and I had never thought about it again until this exact moment, standing in a classroom light years from that porch, staring down at a piece of some long-dead alien creature's skeleton. I looked around the workshop floor until I found what I needed. Near the edge of the room, there was a strip of composite flooring with a rough, gritty texture where two tiles met unevenly. It was not meant to be used for anything. It was simply worn from years of foot traffic. But it was rough enough. I knelt down, gripped the bone in both hands, and began to grind it against the seam in the floor. It was slow, painfully slow. My arms ached almost immediately, and after 20 minutes I had barely managed to smooth one uneven edge. Around me, the sound of hammers striking hot metal rang out in a steady rhythm, almost musical, a song I was not part of. Instructor Vel drifted past my station once, paused, watched for a moment, and said nothing. His silence felt heavier than any words could have. I kept working. An hour passed. My palms turned red, then raw, then numb in a strange, distant way that told me I would regret this later, but did not care right now. Slowly, painfully, an edge began to take shape along one side of the bone. It was not sharp, not yet, but it was no longer just a shapeless lump. It had a direction, a purpose. Selah glanced over again, her expression unreadable. What is that supposed to be? A knife, I said, not looking up. It looked like a rock an hour ago. It's getting there. She did not say anything else, but I noticed she kept glancing over every few minutes after that, as if she could not quite believe what she was watching. By the second hour, my strokes had found a rhythm. Grind, check the edge, adjust the angle, grind again. I used my thumbnail to test the sharpness the way my grandfather taught me, running it lightly along the edge to feel for resistance. It caught slightly. Progress. The forge 2 stations down from mine let out a hiss of steam as a Patesic student quenched his blade in a basin of water, and the sudden sound made me jump. My focus had narrowed so completely onto the bone in my hands that I had almost forgotten there was an entire room of other students around me, each shaping their own weapon out of metal that bent to fire and hammer, materials built for exactly this purpose. I had none of that. I had my own hands, a rough patch of flooring, and 200,000 years of memory buried somewhere in my bones that I did not even know I carried until I needed it. By the third hour, the edge had become something real, not beautiful, not polished, but real. I could see where the blade tapered to a point, where the spine thickened for strength, where a rough guard had begun to form near what would become the handle. I used the still warm edge of a nearby forge vent to smooth a small burr that had raised along one side, careful not to press too hard or too long, testing the heat first, with the back of my hand, the way I had been taught to test a stove as a child. I did not have cord for a handle, so I tore a strip from the sleeve of my uniform and wrapped it tightly around the base of the bone, tying it off the way I used to tie my shoes when I was small, before I learned faster methods. It was not elegant. It did not need to be elegant. It needed to work. With 20 minutes left on the clock, I held up the finished blade and looked at it properly for the first time since I had started. It was pale, uneven, scarred with the marks of a rough stone floor instead of a proper grinding wheel. The handle was wrapped in torn fabric instead of leather or wire. Next to the gleaming metal blades around the room, it looked like something a child had made in an afternoon. But it had an edge, a real one. When Instructor Vel called time, 31 students placed 31 blades on their stations, each one catching the overhead lights and throwing back small flashes of silver and gold. Beautiful work, precise work, the kind of craftsmanship that came from generations of practice passed down through cultures that had never stopped forging metal. I placed my bone knife next to them, and for a moment, I felt smaller than I had felt in a long time. Instructor Vel drifted down the row slowly, lifting each blade in turn, pressing it against a small resistance pad built into the wall that measured edge sharpness, balance, and durability. Numbers scrolled across the display above our heads. Good numbers. Solid, expected numbers from cadets using proper tools and proper training. He reached my station last. He lifted the bone knife carefully, almost gently, as if he expected it to crumble apart in his grip. He turned it over the way I had turned it over 3 hours earlier, studying the uneven edge, the torn fabric handle, the rough grind marks along its length. Then he pressed it against the resistance pad. The number that appeared was not spectacular. It was nowhere near the numbers the metal blades had produced, but it was not 0. It was a real, measured number, proof that the strange pale object in his hand was, in fact, a working tool, a blade, a knife, exactly as I had claimed. The room went quiet. I could feel eyes on me, not with pity this time, but with something closer to disbelief. "Cadet Doyle," Instructor Vell said slowly, "you were not given equipment suited for shaping this material." "No, sir. You were given no instruction on bone working. It is not part of this curriculum, nor any curriculum I am aware of at this academy." "No, sir." He turned the blade over once more in his manipulators, his 4 eyes narrowing slightly, the way someone might look at a puzzle they could not quite solve. "Then explain to me, Cadet Doyle, how you knew what to do." I thought about the porch, about my grandfather's hands moving in slow, patient circles, about a summer I had once considered boring, and now understood differently. I thought about how humans had spent nearly all of our history with nothing but stone, bone, and stubbornness, long before anyone discovered how to smelt metal at all. "We've been doing this a very long time," I said, "long before we had forges or furnaces. Give a human almost nothing, and enough time, and we will find a way to make it useful." Selah, beside me, looked down at the bone knife, then up at me, then back down again. She did not say anything for a long moment. "I think," she finally said, "I am glad we are not enemies." A few quiet laughs rippled through the room, breaking the tension that had built up over the last several minutes. Even Instructor Vell made a small clicking sound that I had come to recognize, after weeks in his class, as something close to amusement. He set the bone knife down carefully on my station, almost with respect, and moved on to record the final scores. I thought that would be the end of it. A strange story to tell later, an unusual grade to add to my transcript, nothing more. But 2 days later, I was called into the office of the Academy's dean, a tall Vashk elder, named Director Kor, whose reputation for being difficult to impress was well known across every department. I sat across from her desk, nervous, unsure why I had been summoned. She held a small data pad in one hand, and on the screen was a photograph of my bone knife, taken from some angle I had not noticed anyone capturing during the exam. "Instructor Vell submitted a report about your practical exam," she said, her voice flat and unreadable. "He believes it may be of interest to our engineering department." "I'm not sure I understand," I said. "Most species in this academy," she continued, "arrive already knowing how to solve problems using the tools their culture has spent centuries perfecting. When those tools are removed, most species struggle to adapt, because they have never needed to." She set the data pad down and folded her long fingers together. "Your species appears to carry a different kind of memory, not one written down in books, but one carried in instinct, passed from generation to generation through simple actions. A grandfather teaching a child to grind bone against stone, for example." I felt my face grow warm. I didn't think anyone noticed things like that. "We notice everything, Cadet Doyle. That is our job." She almost smiled, though on a Vashk face it was hard to tell for certain. "We would like to invite you to join a small research group studying adaptive problem-solving across species. It would involve additional coursework, but also additional opportunities not normally offered to first-year cadets." I did not know what to say. A week ago, I had walked into a classroom expecting to fail an assignment because of an equipment mistake. Now I was being offered a place in a research program I had never even heard of before that moment. "Why me?" I asked. "There must be other cadets who could solve problems just as well, maybe better." Director Kor studied me for a long moment before answering, because, when given nothing, You did not wait for someone to give you something. You looked at what you had, and you decided it was enough. That instinct cannot be taught in a classroom, Cadet Doyle. It can only be recognized when it appears. I accepted the offer, of course. It would have been foolish not to, but what stayed with me longer than the offer itself was the way Instructor Vell looked at me the next time I walked into his classroom. There was no more pity in his eyes, no more quiet sympathy for the one student without the proper equipment. There was something closer to curiosity, respect maybe, though I still was not entirely sure how to read expressions on a species so different from my own. A few weeks later, during a lesson on advanced material properties, Instructor Vell paused the class and held up a small, familiar object. My bone knife, cleaned now, mounted on a small display stand at the front of the room. "This," he said, addressing the class, "will remain in this classroom for as long as I teach here, not because it is the finest blade any student has ever made. It is not. But because it represents something more valuable than craftsmanship. It represents the ability to look at nothing and see potential." Nothing. Sella caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, quiet smile. I smiled back, feeling a strange mixture of embarrassment and pride settle somewhere in my chest. I thought about my grandfather that night, back in my dormitory room, staring up at the ceiling long after everyone else had gone to sleep. I wondered if he had any idea, all those years ago on that porch, that the lesson he was teaching me would one day matter, light years away from the cabin where he taught it. I wondered if he understood that patience, stubbornness, and the willingness to work with your hands when nothing else was offered were not small lessons at all, but some of the most important ones a person could carry. I still have that summer memory clearly, the smell of pine trees, the rough feel of stone against bone, the sound of his voice telling me that anything worth making should cost you something. It cost me blistered hands and 3 hours of my life that day in the workshop. But it also opened a door I never expected to walk through, in a place I never expected to end up, surrounded by species who had spent centuries perfecting tools I had never even heard of before arriving at this academy. Sometimes I think about how easily I could have taken Sella's offer to trade seats that day, how easily I could have sat back, let someone else's forge do the work, and avoided the ache in my hands entirely. It would have been simpler, easier. No one would have blamed me for accepting help when the material I had been given was clearly unfair to begin with. But I think about what Director Core said, about instinct that cannot be taught, only recognized when it appears. I think she was right. There is something in the way humans approach problems that goes back further than any of us can fully explain, something written into us long before we understood what writing even was. We do not always have the best tools. We do not always start with the same advantages as everyone around us. But give us a little time, a little patience, and something, anything, to work with, and we will find a way to shape it into what we need. My grandfather knew that. Now, thanks to one strange afternoon in a classroom full of aliens, Director Core and Instructor Vell knew it too. And somewhere in a display case at the front of a classroom, light years from a quiet porch in the countryside, a small, uneven bone knife sits as proof of exactly that lesson, waiting for the next student who looks down at their station and finds nothing where something should be. Because sometimes, nothing is only the beginning.